because there's a lot of high trust, not only in governments and in institutions like banks. The need for an alternative financial system is just not there. And so who gets into it in Canada is very different as to who gets into it in the developing world. Libertarians, generally people who are at the cutting edge of experimenting with financial innovation, programmers, people who are into technology. It's not the same people that get into it in El Salvador and developing nations. Especially if you're shielding yourself from inflation, if you're shielding yourself from confiscation of money, like what happened in Lebanon, you want to shelter yourself, right?
Welcome to Bitcoin Basics with your hosts Faris and Gordon. Visit bitcoinbasics.help if you need help buying and securing your Bitcoin.
Join our Bitcoin Basics community in our new Telegram group at bitcoinbasics.help/telegram. No ads, no altcoins, shitcoins, no other nonsense, only Bitcoin information, education and discussion at bitcoinbasics.help/telegram. Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Bitcoin Basics podcast with your host, me, that's Gordon, and I have Faris as usual. Before we get started, let's do our proof recording. Today is the 19th of July, 2022. The current price of Bitcoin is $21,590. The current block height is 745,542. And my favorite stat, $1 equals 4,631 Satoshis, according to bitcoin.clarkmeter.com, if you have no idea what I was talking about. So we just had an amazing interview, Faris. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, so we interviewed Jaime, hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Jaime Garcia. Yeah. He writes for Bitcoin Magazine. Very, very interesting because he was born and raised in El Salvador, and he relocated to Canada when he was 10 years old. And now with everything that's going on in El Salvador in the Bitcoin space, he's become this go-to guy where people overseas are asking what's happening in El Salvador. So he's got a connection to El Salvador and living in Canada. So and obviously Bitcoin has been in the news for Canada and El Salvador. So it was interesting to get his viewpoint from that. A couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Nikki and James, who are boots on the ground living in El Salvador using the Lightning Network. So they kind of gave us a good micro perspective of what it's like every day using Bitcoin in El Salvador. With Jaime, it was really interesting because he is looking more at the macro perspective. How does this affect El Salvador, who still uses the US dollar as their nominal currency? How does this affect their relations with the IMF, the World Bank, the United States? So that was really, really cool to get that big macro perspective from him.
Yeah, I think he's obviously El Salvadorian, so he's an insider, but currently living in Canada. So he's an insider looking from the outside, looking in sort of thing, if that makes sense. And I really appreciated his honesty and critical thinking. We always think that Bitcoin's going to save the world and save everything, but he had a very balanced and sort of practical viewpoint of what is actually happening, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I appreciated his intellectual honesty on that. So without further ado, here's the interview.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share so we can find others like yourself.
Hello, Jaime. Thank you very much for joining us today. And it's really an honor to have you on. I caught you on the Bitcoin Twitter Spaces, And just got in touch with you then. And just tell our audience a little bit about yourself. What is it you do and how you got into this space?
Yeah. So Jaime Garcia, I'm Salvadorian, also Canadian. I'm based out of Canada, but do have a lot of family back in El Salvador. And Really, my involvement is fairly recent. My dad actually is thinking of going back home and investing in a property to sort of retire and just take it easy. And when the legal currency law got announced, he asked me to look into it to see, what it was all about, whether it was something that he should be getting into, and just find out in general what were the benefits and I guess the maybe a negative side of it. And so I think that being the firstborn, I think that I do a lot of that work for my dad, and so I went down the rabbit hole just right quickly, and I do attribute him with orange pilling me right off the get go just by sending me on that journey, and then luckily for myself, I got into contact with some really good people in Twitter Spaces that were maxis, and I think that really fortunate that I didn't go down the altcoin route and get wrecked and experiment that way. And yes, I got to learn a lot very quickly, and from that point forward, I think that I was almost mesmerized, if not kind of regretful that I hadn't taken it serious a lot sooner, because like everybody else, knew about it a long time ago, just didn't dive into it. And so really that is my story. And then listening to people on Twitter Spaces talk about El Salvador, I quickly realized that most people didn't know where El Salvador was. And there's a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of wrong information. And I started to weigh in, and I became kind of like, I guess in my circle of friends, de facto expert on it. Just, being from there, going there, having family there, having a bit of a ground level knowledge of the country and the culture and the business environment there. I think that it allowed me to speak with some authority, and when there was discussions around El Salvador. So
were you born and raised in El Salvador?
Yes, I was born there, and I left El Salvador when I was 11. Like many Salvadorians, I left because of the Civil War in the 80s, and I came to Canada, and then I've been in Canada ever since. Of course, I go back to El Salvador to visit and keep in touch, but really, I'm now here in Canada. I have a Canadian wife, kids, and my mom and dad are here. My sister was here, but she left for Costa Rica, so she lives in Costa Rica now, and but she is Canadian, and so my immediate family was here. When my grandparents were alive, we brought them up as well. As you know, like many Latin families, we like to have our parents and grandparents close to us. We have a cousin up here as well, and then I think everybody else in our family is spread, other than El Salvador, spread across the world, but mainly in the U.S. I think we're the few that are in Canada. So
we recently had an interview that had actually done very more popular than we thought. We interviewed a couple that moved from New Zealand to El Salvador because Bitcoin was becoming legal tender, but also because it didn't fall down the whole government lockdowns and mandates that they had. They kind of went there for freedom and Bitcoin. And El Salvador is making a lot of headlines. But is that just in the Bitcoin Twitter sphere, or are you finding that in Canada, like you said, more and more people are asking you about El Salvador? because to us it's a big deal, but is that just a small echo chamber in Twitter land, Bitcoin land, or is what's happening in El Salvador a bit more mainstream?
Yeah, I think, everybody has to look at things with an extra critical eye nowadays, because there's a variety of news sources and a lot of information. The reality is that, the country is just like any other country in the world. It's not just about Bitcoin. They have, infrastructure issues, health issues, economic issues, and you have to find me an example of a country that didn't react very similarly at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't think that there's many, and El Salvador was no exception, right? So, which is why sometimes you'll hear and everything's 2020 in retrospect, of course, right? So, it will be very difficult to find an example of a country who wasn't a little bit harsh on their citizens when it comes to lockdowns and so on and so forth, mainly because they didn't know what they were dealing with. There wasn't enough data and so on. And so what you'll hear some folks like Gladstein and Anita Posh kind of say is that, El Salvador was extra harsh on their citizens by quarantining them in camps and putting a lot of restrictive and very harsh measures by those people entering the country early during the pandemic, and very difficult lockdowns during the early part of the pandemic. And from what I understand, that's actually accurate. And but that's not to say that the country and the people from El Salvador didn't actually agree with that. There was a lot of agreement, and people were happy that those things were being implemented because they were scared, right? A lot of people were really scared, and so I would say that we tend to look and idealize some aspects of El Salvador right now. But the reality is that they were just like any other country at the beginning of this whole ordeal. So
thanks again for coming onto the podcast. We really appreciate your time, and we really appreciate your perspective as well. In the Bitcoin community, we tend to have our rose-colored glasses on, and it's all rainbows and unicorns. And it's really good to speak to people who have that dose of reality. And comparing El Salvador to Canada, in terms of Bitcoin adoption, what would you see as the biggest difference?
Well, I mean, there's several aspects to it. I would say that, here, and I know that Canada has gone through some challenges in the last little bit. I think that there has been some government overreach. I think folks have generally tolerated that. And again, I'm not gonna be super, I guess, towing the hard maxi line, but the reality is that whether people agree with it or not, Canada's a pretty safe country. Generally, the perspective of most Canadians is that the government is acting on their best interest. You're not seeing, in general, the police randomly attacking people, and while there is some documented isolated incidents, there's a high trust in government, right? So when things happen, the trucker rally back in Ottawa, people tend to kind of side and believe the narrative from the government, particularly because, again, you don't see there's high trust in the government. People aren't really looking at the deeper issues as to why, the economy is the way that it is, why, central banks work the way that they work. And people are kind of going one way and they trust it. And even how the government of Canada reacted in providing people some basic money for basic expenses. And generally people view that with a lot of positive views. That's in general, people feel like that is a good thing, and that's why governments that's what governments are supposed to do. When people aren't able to work, then they get them some money, and then they're able to buy their necessities, right? So there's a lot of high trust, right? And so because there's a lot of high trust, not only in governments and in institutions like banks, the need for an alternative financial system is just not there. And so who gets into it in Canada is very different as to who gets into it in the developing world. People who get into it in Canada historically, and Canada has an amazing cast of OGs, like NVK, you got BTC sessions. I mean, it's generally people who are into technology, generally people who are libertarians, generally people who are at the cutting edge of experimenting with financial innovation, programmers, people who are into technology. It's not the same people that get into it in El Salvador and developing nations. Especially if you're shielding yourself from inflation, if you're shielding yourself from confiscation of money, like what happened in Lebanon, you want to shelter yourself, right? And so I would start by saying that's the main difference, but at the same time, if I was to walk down the street here, just outside of the building where I'm at, and ask a random person if they've heard of it, maybe they have, maybe they haven't. It's like a 50-50 chance. And if they have, and you ask them if they want some, they'll be distrustful because the story that they've heard is probably one about being illegal or something like that. I actually went to change the oil in my vehicle over the weekend, and I asked the young guy there, it's like, hey, do you have a Bitcoin wallet? I want to tip you in Bitcoin. And he's like, no, I don't. So I'm like, well, why don't you download one? And I said, download Moon, and it's pretty easy. And he's like, no, thank you. He said, well, I'll give you $20 worth of Bitcoin. And then he's like, no, it's okay. I'll look into it. It's okay. That's really good. You should definitely look into it. And, but then if I think about in El Salvador, they'll probably do the same thing, right? It's like, do you have dollars? But if you really, but if you're like, no, I'll give you Bitcoin, they'll probably accept the Bitcoin because they have the means of exchanging it and converting to dollars very easily. Whereas here, the onboarding curve is a little bit more steeper now, right? Like a year ago, maybe it would have been different, but now that we're 10 months in, things are changing in El Salvador. And, but yeah.
So just on that point of onboarding, the tech is obviously available in Canada for people to onboard. They do have the wallets, the apps, the ability. It's more an educational or misconception of what Bitcoin is. Is that right?
I would say so, yeah. And again, I would say that because there's no actual financial need, urgent need. People are aware, but they just don't make the effort.
Yeah, countries that adopted Bitcoin are the ones where, there was no credibility in their sovereign currency, especially due to hyperinflation. But with what you mentioned, the truckers convoy, and you also mentioned funds that can be obfuscated by the government. Now, isn't that what happened, though? Didn't the Canadian government cancel the GoFundMe contributions and basically said retroactively anyone who funded those truckers was, I'm trying to remember this correctly, was actually violating the anti-money laundering laws, and it was essentially an act of financial terrorism?
I'm not quite certain that was the wording, but that my understanding is that we're very close to that, especially the folks that were an integral part of organizing that. Again, I don't have an insider knowledge on that, but that is my understanding, and so rather than opining on that specific bit, I can tell you this much. I can tell you people in my circle of friends who usually tend to be social democrats or liberals, and definitely some conservatives who said, this is not right, who were probably otherwise very supportive of like Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government, and who really were turned off by what they felt was an overreach. And I would say that, at the height of the pandemic, when, some of these things were happening, there was no need to implement an Emergencies Act. It took this one incident, and people are just sort of puzzled by it. It's like, is it really that bad, or is it something that we don't know that's happening? And even the conservatives after, where they held some hearings, the government held some hearings, and the conservatives in committee, and these hearings were questioning the government. The government was never able to produce like conclusive evidence. Now, I'm not opining on this as some expert, but just as some like Joe Schmo, common average dude, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I'm buying this whole piece. And so I think what the whole thing created was a mistrust in our financial system, to the point where there was never any. And I think that if you were to think about Canada as, before that incident, as being one of the friendliest places to invest in and put your money in, I think we had like a number of spot ETFs already approved, as well as even like altcoin ETFs, and, pretty readily available exchanges where people could invest in. Like now you have distrust. And I think that, that piece in itself, I think, is even the more significant key takeaway from that whole situation, is that people who otherwise had a lot of trust in the government, what they were doing, began to question, right? And that's kind of where the transition that I like to point out, where, a lot of people didn't have a lot of trust, or had a lot of trust in the government, didn't seek any refuge in Bitcoin, now started to think about it, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because, my dad's an accountant, and he's a stick in the mud. And so, I've been trying to orange pill him for, 5-6 years. But it's a really interesting point you make, because in Western countries, let's be honest, apart from a few Bitcoin maxis or whatever, people use Bitcoin to trade. They send it to an exchange, they do some trading or whatever. They're not using Bitcoin as a method of payment. It is a store of value for a very, very small fraction of the people. Because of what you just said, there is this inherent trust in government money. And it's like, well, I've heard about Bitcoin, it's internet funny money, but, I'll just stick with my shares and stocks and maybe buy some gold or ETFs or whatever. So I think that there is a little bit of a light bulb moment in that, what happened with the truckers incident, without going into details. But I'm fascinated with El Salvador and it's funny, we're asking you like you're the spokesman of El Salvador and whatever. I'm not meaning that by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, but I am writing a book on it, so
okay. Oh, tell us about that then.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to put in at least 1 hour every day, and my goal is to have it done by have a draft done by the fall, but in hopefully September of 2022. But it's not as easy as I thought it would be, and so and it's definitely kind of like, you know, what I want. Like the purpose of it is to basically just showcase why it emerged, you know, what were the conditions that gave the environment for this phenomenon, and just, you know, understand the country, because I think
when you say this, you're referring to El Salvador and Bitcoin as legal tender? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Why Bitcoin is a legal currency in El Salvador emerged, and just the nuances as to what led to the rise of it in the environment that gave this phenomenon to emerge in El Salvador. Because I think that's what's lacking. And that's what leads to a lot of just misinformation or assumptions, right? So I'm trying to make it succinct and to the point, but I think that there also needs to be some background as to why this happens without making it boring. I don't know. It's my first crack at the can. I've wrote a few articles for Bitcoin Magazine, but I think a book's a little different.
And this is in English, or are you gonna do it in Spanish as well?
I'm writing it in English, and then once I'm happy with the draft and I have somewhat of a semi-final draft, I'm going to translate it into Spanish.
Awesome.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share so we can find others like yourself.
So we're fascinated in El Salvador. I don't know where to start. Are you involved in Bitcoin Beach at all?
No, I met some of the guys through Twitter. Mike Peterson has given me a couple interviews, and I know Chimbera through Bitcoin Twitter, and you know, we've done a number of spaces together. So yeah, it's just met them. They're internet friends for sure.
No, that's awesome. So obviously you can only comment, you know, family and friends and people you know. And boots on the ground, is it sort of being adopted purely as a method of payment, and people are receiving sort of stuff in Bitcoin? We've interviewed Nikki and James from El Salvador a couple of episodes, if people want to check that out. So we won't go over that, but is that sort of you know, most merchants are accepting it, and there's sort of that feeling of, yeah, it's an alternate method, or is it just a really sort of small micro system of a few funny people doing some funny stuff with funny money?
Yeah, it depends where you are. So if you're in El Sonte, definitely there's lots of options. And I would say that, you know, in most instances, you can be 100% paying in Bitcoin through Lightning. If you step out of there, I think that then it becomes a little bit more challenging. In certain areas in San Salvador, there's definitely you know, if you want to go to Starbucks and McDonald's, Walmart, Super Selectos, which is a grocery store, you're not going to have any problems, and you'll be paying Bitcoin, and it'll be good. Pizza Hut, Pollo Campero, which is a really it's like our Kentucky Fried Chicken in El Salvador. Yeah. And the funny thing about them is they had some problems with their point of sale system. And so they stopped accepting it for a while. But I checked back with them, and they said they're back accepting it. So yeah, there's this weird period where like some people are kind of finding, you know, how, you know, like how they become to adopt it. And so some people are in trial and error and with different point of systems when it comes to businesses. But in general, I mean, I'm going to be honest. No. And that's because I think that to really understand why this was brought upon the country it's not because there was a huge necessity by its population to use it. But I actually didn't think that I fully understood this until I saw an interview by this political analyst. His name is Dagoberto Gutierrez, and he's a really, really smart person, and he gets on Salvadorian radio as well as television, generally very supportive of Nayib Bukele. But sometimes he does criticize him, but he's a very well-respected man. And so he got on the radio, and not very government or Nayib Bukele friendly radio. Most media isn't, by the way, because most media is owned by the opposition and they don't really like him. So they do a lot of activity to try to discredit him. And so they try to get Dagoberto into a bit of a gotcha moment. He's an older gentleman. And so they asked him, so, did you download Chivo? Are you using Bitcoin? He's like, no, I'm an old guy. This is not something that I'm really good at. And, so you're not using it then. And he's like, no, I'm not. And then it's like, well, but, we hear that people aren't using it. And I'm like, I'm not using it. Nobody we know is using it. And he said, oh, well, see, that's inconsequential. See, to think that by using Bitcoin, that was the purpose why it was brought in, is to not understand at all why this is being implemented. This is game theory. This is a first mover advantage. And this is not for today. This is for the future. What you're seeing is the decline of a dollar hegemony. And what El Salvador is doing is it's safeguarding itself against that decline. So this is not something that's going to bear fruits today. This is something that's going to bear fruits into the future. And so I was like, okay, right. First, we got to be patient, okay? This is going to take some time. The other thing is that the reasons why we thought that this was being implemented are not really the reasons at all. This is a low time preference move. This is a low time preference action. This is not for us. This is for our children and our grandchildren. And that's kind of what we have to understand. Mm-hmm. And so, most Bitcoiners are impatient with it. The media is impatient with it. Detractors are impatient with it. Promoters are impatient with it. The people in El Salvador are impatient with it, mostly because certain key sectors want it to fail and others are unaware. Like, I have an auntie that's like, she's old. She could care less. She's like, yeah, I've heard of it. What am I going to do? I'm not going to go download an app that I don't understand. But there's somebody turning 18 years old every day in El Salvador. That's when they are entitled to download the Chivo app. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm simping for Chivo because, I have some concerns with it, but.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our listeners probably don't know what that is. Could you explain what that is?
So Chivo is the government wallet. Chivo is the government wallet, and it's obviously a centralized wallet that accepts Bitcoin, but also has the ability to auto-convert Bitcoin into USD. Now, the wallet by law is required to be available for every citizen in the country because as the Bitcoin law is written, the government is to provide the auto conversion feature. Now, the private sector can provide an auto conversion solution, but they're free to do. Strike does that. I believe Bitcoin Beach is working on their own solution. Points of sale systems do that as well. Like OpenNode does that. Ibex Mercado does it. I think there's another company that just started theirs. Oh, I can't remember what their name is. Hopefully I remember and I can say it, because I'm not trying to pick favorites here. I'm not shilling for anybody, but the private sector can do this auto conversion feature, right? But some of them cost money, obviously. Strike doesn't, but definitely Chivo does not, and it's obligated by law for the government to use it. And so then, but obviously, it's, from from a Bitcoin ethos perspective, it's a centralized solution. So, it goes kind of against all of the things why people get into Bitcoin and why they hodl it, why it inspires them to get into it. But for most Salvadorans who just want to transact in it, it provides a good solution if they don't want to actually expose themselves to the volatility of the markets, and so they can accept Bitcoin at an agreed USD price. And then the app has a fund that basically accepts the agreed upon price on Bitcoin and auto converts them into USD. And so the wallet holds USD as well as Bitcoin in it. And so is that kind of a good summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, a lot of the stuff, the devil's in the details, and especially with wallets. Can you withdraw Bitcoin from the Chivo app?
Yeah, so you can actually withdraw Bitcoin from the Chivo app to another wallet, like on chain or on Lightning. Those features, like especially the Lightning, weren't working like super well, and like amounts larger than like 1,000 were at one point being blocked. They didn't even make it into the mempool, it seemed, and it just kind of like it stayed in the ecosystem, and they didn't sort of leave to go to the mempool, so you couldn't even see, the transaction on chain. But I believe they've changed providers to Alpha Point, and I think that a lot of those issues are being resolved. Last time I checked, most of them were resolved, but of course you get outliers, and people have problems here or there. Sometimes it's user error, sometimes there's legit issues with the app, but essentially you can withdraw Bitcoin to another wallet, as well as you can withdraw USD to ATMs, and it gives you cash. And the entire system for Salvadorans using Chivo, there's no fees. So that's the other feature that or benefit that the Chivo wallet through the government provides, right? So yeah, I mean,
so we were watching like Nikki and James, who are in El Salvador now, and they have their YouTube channel where they go around to just street vendors buying groceries with Lightning. And it's fascinating to watch. And it's like, for someone who, New Zealand, Australia, most people think, Bitcoin was that thing still around. To watch this was just incredible to see. Sorry, one thing you brought up was first mover advantage, which I think what El Salvador done is amazing. And we have seen other nation states follow suit. And it's basically, getting off of the petrodollar system and the US dollar reserve system. That is the big macro events at play here. Central African Republic is following suit by the looks of it. We interviewed Lord Fizichua of Tonga. He's trying to bring Bitcoin legal tender in Tonga. Now, with Nayib Bukele, you mentioned he's not very popular with mainstream media that's run by the opposition. His approval ratings are pretty high, though, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the people like him, and there's no denying that, because even when they run their own polls, it shows that he's in the 80s. And historically in El Salvador, no government or no president has ever polled that high. So And given that he does not control the media, it's hard to say that he's actually making this thing up. There is a state paper and a state channel, but that's it. It's 1 to like 20.
So I suppose my query / concern is the first movers. They're the ones that end up with the arrows in the back. They set they're the trailblazers. They set it for the pioneers. He is, pissing off the IMF and the World Bank. It's something I actually discussed with Laura Fujitsu, and he said, we actually asked him this is, are you concerned by moving the Bitcoin and off of the Bretton Woods institutions that it's going to somehow hurt you? And he goes, they haven't done anything for us anyways. So from, looking as an outsider looking in, President is Nayib Bukele is obviously, pissing off the World Bank, the IMF, the American dollar system. Like, how fragile is it that this whole Bitcoin tender is resting on his shoulders only? Like, if he's not around anymore, what's going to happen to the Bitcoin ecosystem there? Does it die with him if he's no longer around, or is there enough of a groundswell to keep it going?
Yeah. And, and I think that the first mover advantage also has the first mover disadvantage, right? If I believe I watched a Bitcoin documentary, and I think the filmmaker actually made an analogy that was something like, if you think of it in military terms, somebody's got to go around the corner and take the first shot, and they risk themselves getting shot, right? And then this, the second person's got to go, and then the third person. But if these first people don't go through it and they don't start taking the shots, then the rest can't go through, right? And in a way, I think that that's kind of like where El Salvador's at. I mean, and I had said in the past is that we're taking it on the chin for the rest of the world, and proudly. But at the same time, I think that it's a bet. It's definitely a calculated bet that things are going to work out. There's many facets to this. It's not just, at least for El Salvador, is not just about Bitcoin. It's a move to provide the country with a stable economy where we can have foreign investment come into the country, which has happened. I saw reports last month that in the first time in 61 years where private investment has, increased that much, right? And they also reported that since the beginning of the year up to May, $52 million came in remittances through the Chiva wallet. Wow. Which had no fees attached to them, right? Their GDP grew by just over 10%, the first double-digit growth in years, and exports went up by 13%. Tourism, since Bitcoin got announced, went up by 30%. But the number one issue still is safety. Right. And so they still need to deal with them. So yeah, first mover advantage and also first mover disadvantage. And also, the fact that Bukele needs a team to execute on this. He is one man, and this does not happen if he doesn't have capable people looking after it. There's probably some, and of course the mainstream media is not interested in giving anybody else any coverage, because then the narrative about him being a dictator doesn't play all that well either, right? But the Minister of Finance, Alejandro Zelaya, what a guy. If that guy was in charge of a G20 economy, he would have that economy roaring right now. he is a very intelligent man. He knows the markets, the TradFi market, inside and out, and he makes really good moves. And he's thinking not just about Bitcoin; he's thinking about other stuff. And they interviewed him on July 13th, and one of the concerns here by the traditional finance sector is whether they're going to default on their sovereign debt. And he said, absolutely not. We actually have the means to pay. We're not going to default. And the thing is that, a few days before that, Bukele said, I hope they apologize when we meet our obligations and then some, because right now they're kind of like singing all this doom and gloom song. And, and when that doesn't happen, they'll forget that they said it. And now they're complaining about not meeting their obligations on their 2025 obligations, right? So it's something, it's always something else, right? But definitely there's a cast of like really, really capable women and men that are part of the government and the legislative assembly. It's kind of like the Congress, who are making things happen for the country, right? I mean, this cast of folks are tired of like El Salvador being in the news for the wrong things. They realize that we've had such a brain drain of amazing people leave the country, and they want to attract them. They want their best people to remain in El Salvador and to make sure that they become valuable assets for the country rather than for Canada or the US or Europe, right?
I'm really looking forward to your book coming out, Jaime. It's the Bitcoin origin story in El Salvador. Just sounds fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very encouraging. It's very encouraging to hear that as well, because I think a lot of Bitcoiners, we sort of think, it's going to solve everything. We put Bitcoin in the country, everyone starts to use it. In a couple of years, it's, rainbows and unicorns, but that's not the case, of course. I just going back a little bit to remittances, and this is one of the major sort of use cases. It sounds like people are using Bitcoin for remittances, or are they? Are they still using Western Union's 40 or 30% fees or whatever it is?
Yeah. Like, I mean, even in my family, I asked my mom, are you using Chivo to send auntie or whoever, money? They're like, no. I'm like, why not? Oh, they don't want to. So you're using like Western Union? Yes, she said, but the fees have gone down. So you see, like, that's the story. That's the story right there. If you think about, nobody's using Bitcoin, then yeah, there's no story. It's a terrible story. It's failing. What a terrible experiment. But if you think about the rippling effects, the banks and these third parties that administer these transfers have now competition, and they've had to adjust to that competition. So even though people aren't using Bitcoin, they're benefiting from the introduction of Bitcoin. Their fees are lower. Now they don't have a monopoly on this anymore. You see, and those are the benefits that are not being told. Okay. Here's the other thing. A lot of people aren't using Chivo. They're using Strike. I think BitRefill actually has their proprietary information about how many people are using BitRefill. And hopefully they share them at some point. I've seen them share them in some sessions that they hold at the Adopting Bitcoin conference. And I think Bitcoin 2022, they had some slides, I think, or maybe, I don't know. You'll have to verify that one and not trust me. But what they showed is that, there was, although Chivo was like number one, there's other wallets being used in order to buy some of these gift cards, right? Not only that, like, for example, I can buy some Bitcoin right now and go to my cousin's to bit refill and pay for my cousin's electricity bill or his cell phone bill directly from it. That doesn't actually make it in as a remittance, but it's, like if they were using that money to buy that, I could just pay it myself from here.
Sorry, so you can pay a utility bill in El Salvador using Bitcoin.
Yep. So Ferris, say you live in El Salvador and you need a little bit of help, and you're like, I can't make ends meet this year, and you have a mortgage, and here's my mortgage number, and you give it to me and Gordon, and we get together and we buy some Bitcoin, and then we pay your mortgage payment on the account number that you give me through Bit Refill.
Yeah,
Done.
wow, that's awesome. Yeah.
Done. You can look, go to Bit Refill right now, go to the El Salvador section. They'll show you all the utilities and services that you can pay for. You can pay for water, electricity, cell phone, land phone. You can pay for, there's a housing lender, the state housing lender, that, low-income people or people who are first just starting with their homes get mortgages from. They're on there as well. There is health insurance in there as well. So all of these services that people usually need those remittances to be paid for are on Bit Refill, and people can pay for them directly without even sending the money.
Amazing.
So
that's something that caught me by surprise was there is actually a large amount of El Salvador's GDP that is reliant on remittances.
As much as 23% last time I checked. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
wow.
So you have to dig deeper in the story, because obviously, there was an alternative study that showed, and it was a survey study. So they randomly chose people and they said, look, are you using this? Are you using Chivo? Are you using this wallet? Are you using that? It showed that only 3% out of the randomly picked people that they did for the study. It's a survey, right? But it's a survey, which is, I'm not actually sure what the methodology was. So, not sure if it was really representative of the population or if it was a specific sample. And, but when you look at operational data, hard data, not opinion-based data, then it begins to tell a different story, right? So,
how much of El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption is necessity, ideology versus just practical, I want to save money on fees?
Well, the reality is that the remittance story wasn't really one of the main objectives of Bitcoin. I was actually Mackenzie Sigelos from CNBC interviewed me a while back on it and how it happened, because I had made one of those first remittance payments on Bitcoin and compared it to the traditional, Western Union, right, system. And so, but up until then, remittance wasn't one of the main purposes for the Bitcoin law and Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador. And as a matter of fact, I wrote an article on this on Bitcoin Magazine, and there's really three purposes of the law. The first one is that, any law has to be for the a benefit of most Salvadorians, and so that they could, grow and attain wealth, right? So that's one. And the second one is so that through the free market, the second one is that through the introduction of these laws, they are able to be included into the financial services, given that 70% at that time, 70% of the population was unbanked. and gain better access to exercising their rights. That's the second purpose. It's written in the law. And the third purpose is so that through the free market, economic solutions are implemented for the growth of the country and the enrichment of most Salvadorians. Three things, very clear, nowhere in there, and not even in the points afterwards, does it mention remittances. So remittances are a bit of a red herring in this whole thing that not only, traditional media and the mainstream media and traditional finance has hung on to, but also Bitcoiners alike and supporters of it. And so when they don't see, a huge success story right away, they feel like it's a failure. But if we were to think about, the main purposes of why Bitcoin exists in El Salvador, it doesn't even make the cut. So really, that's not the benchmark for success in the country.
Yeah, gone are the days when you used to plan 50 years in the future. Now people are lucky if they have an attention span of more than 7 minutes.
Yeah.
There is, the Bitcoin ecosystem to me, like the possibilities, like you talked about the unbanked. Gordon, I remember years ago telling me about Bitcoin. He was excited about the technological aspects of blockchain. I didn't really appreciate Bitcoin until I looked at the economics of it, because that's my economics and aid and development were my background. So there is so much still that Bitcoin can do. So it's exciting to talk to people like you when you're insightful with what's going on. So are you making plans to relocate to El Salvador? Are you happy where you are? How's this affected you personally?
Listen, that's the idea, right? I'm still, even though the gray hairs tell a different story, I'm still relatively young. At least I feel young. I mean, I still go play soccer and run, and I did throw out my back a little bit this weekend, but I was just being stupid, jumping into the pool and whatnot. So
the gray hairs just tell me that you have children. That's where mine came from.
Yes, that is true. That is true. So I mean, but that's the idea. I remember when my wife and I were younger, and we were just blue skying, and it's like, oh, wouldn't it be nice that down the road when we retire, we maybe find a beach home in Costa Rica and retire there. And then I remember my wife sort of backtrack a little bit. Why not El Salvador? I mean, you're from there, and and I said, no, it's too dangerous. It's things aren't right there. And, I don't know if they'll ever be. And then she's like, really? Oh, okay. And then we sort of went back to Costa Rica. But now, over the last year, I think we're changing our kind of our story, right? A little bit about what we're aiming for, because now maybe it's a possibility. And I think if this wasn't happening, I'm not sure it would be a possibility. I think that it's making the country look very hard at what kind of country it wants to be. Crime is definitely a thing that holds it back. So it's trying very, very hard to deal with it. And this is at the expense of many people criticizing it because of human rights violation accusations and so on. Look, it's not going to be easy. It was a very difficult situation, even, a year ago. It's going to be continuing to be difficult, but it's something that needs to happen. Otherwise, who wants to go and invest in a country that is unsafe, right? And I think that that's kind of again, if we think about what, those three main purposes of the law, to have the free markets, enrich the country through, and who wants to invest in a country that is not safe? So we have to provide an environment that is safe for investors. And, it's going to be difficult getting there, but I think that, hopefully it gets there. And Gordon, I just want to maybe touch back on something that you had asked earlier. How much is practicality versus ideology? And I think that it's all practicality. And that's why it's sometimes difficult, because we may not like some of the methods that are being used, but they're practical. And we may not like that it takes a long time, but it's practical. If I'm sure they can hurry it along, but it may look good, but over the long term and practical. And I think it's definitely, I'm not a blind Bukele booster. I always want to see where the downfalls are. And he's made a few mistakes. But in general, I would say that he's doing a good job. There's proof of work there. He was mayor of a couple cities before, and he left them better than he found them. And that's why people trust them, right? So,
well, we appreciate your candor and being honest, because sometimes it is easy to sort of fall into that trap of, rose-colored glasses. And we look forward to your book too. I'm fascinated. Maybe experiment's the wrong word to use, but I'm fascinated by this implementation of, warts and all. I expected some friction, some teething problems, not just technology, but from an adoption point of view. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I hope you get back to El Salvador. But in terms of the safety, has that changed in the last year or two since Bitcoin's become legal tender, or is that unrelated?
No, it has changed. It has changed. I think that one of the things that, many people say is that, Bitcoin changes you, right? And although that might sound kind of corny and a little bit quasi-religious or pseudo-religious, right? The reality is that it, a system like Bitcoin, especially as your monetary legal tender system, offers different types of incentives, right? So the incentive right now is to clean up the country. Otherwise, Bitcoiners won't come. Okay. Things when Bukele took over started to improve in terms of crime. What had happened before his government is that there was a lot of backroom deals, and there's even some accusations that Bukele's government did some of that. I don't know. And I certainly don't have convincing proof that has happened. But even if it did, I would just say that there's precedent there. And what's happening now is that has discontinued. And that's why we saw from what I understand, a spike in crime that prompted a response from Bukele. And that response was to basically suspend certain individual rights so that they were able to incarcerate some known criminals. And in El Salvador, we have this concept within the Constitution pertaining to habeas corpus, which is a lot of countries have that. In essence, what that means is you can't be held indefinitely, arbitrarily, without, having your time in front of the judge and be charged with something, and everybody's presumed innocent until proven guilty. The current state basically extends the habeas corpus from 72 hours to 15 days so that it gives judges time to process these criminals, properly charge them, getting them the paperwork, and actually sentence them. Because what was happening before is there was a huge backlog of cases. And because of habeas corpus, basically was a catch and release. So you catch them because there's a backlog. You can't process them because you can't process them. They have to let them go. So this gives the judges a little bit more time to actually deal with it without having to let them go. And so a lot of people are not super stoked about what's happening there. Because it is a suspension of individual rights, and as Bitcoiners, most early ones, at least with libertarian points of views, that's a cardinal sin, right? So, and myself, I'm not like a fan of it. But I know that it has to be a temporary thing that this government's trying to do in order to deal with this problem. And because of it, it's gotten safer. Reports are that in neighborhoods, what they did is they collected rent, right? And this collected rent was basically shakedown money. Everybody had to pay some money to the local clica, which is like the local gang, and then they. That was their source of income. Now, that has stopped in some areas, and so there's that money circulates back into the economy, right? I mean, you could argue that it circulates back into the economy one way or another, but it circulates back into the economy to better the life of Salvadorians who are actually working hard for their money and who would otherwise, not be doing that and living in fear, are now enjoying the fruit of their work and using that money to better their quality of life rather than, support somebody else's quality of life. And then the incentive has changed. Now the incentive before the incentive was easy, was to choose the easy, crime is not easy. That's the other thing. but the path of crime, because that's what paid. Now the incentive has changed, is like crime does not pay. We have to look at other things, right? So maybe go to school, maybe have a job, or, because even though that might be hard work, is actually not as hard as, living in fear and shaking people down. And like even gang members, some of them, they just don't feel good about it, but they're forced to do it. Right. So I'm not shilling for any of them. I'm just saying that, it's a vicious cycle. Right.
So do you have plans to go revisit El Salvador soon?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. We'd love to catch up with you on the ground there if you do have time. That'd be fascinating to do.
For sure. Like I host a spaces called Global Bitcoin Fest, and we've interviewed over 27 different communities around the world, 27 different countries, about how their circular economy goes, is trying to adopt Bitcoin, and so the goal is to try to host one from El Salvador when I'm there. The goal is for me to be there during the Adopting Bitcoin conference, but I still have to see, like, it's the busy time here at home with work, and my family was planning on going there, and doesn't really align with that time. So I just gotta arrange a few things to see if I can make it happen. But definitely, when I'm there, I would love to do something to make sure that we have, I have something to going on, and I can communicate that from the ground. So,
sorry, you just mentioned the spaces. Could you just tell all our listeners where they can find you, follow your journey, your handles and such?
Yeah. So my Twitter handle is Jaime W. Garcia. It's at JAIMEWGARCIA. And I host, myself and my co-host Lucas Duchko, we co-host Global Bitcoin Fest, and the handle for that on Twitter is at Global BTC Fest, and that's Global at GLOBALBTC FEST. There you go.
We'll have all that in the show notes anyway.
Yeah.
Listening. My real question was actually, is it safe for me to come to El Salvador?
Oh no, for sure. No. Like, actually, you know what? Like, I can say that. No. I can say that with like a lot of confidence. Like, if you guys were to go down there, it would be extremely safe for you guys. I mean, you know, like the safety aspect affects more or less local Salvadorans more than it affects you know, Bitcoiners visiting the country. Usually the areas that where you will go are very, very safe. You know, unless you want to go to other communities where there's known criminal activity, you know, you'll be very safe. And even then, like, you know, like things are improving. Like, I know that Stacy Herbert and Max Kaiser went down to Soyapango and Apopa, which are typically known for a lot of criminal activity, and they hung out with people there. They did a local cleanup in one of the creeks, and they tipped everybody in sats to make sure that their community was cleaned up pretty good. And so these are areas where, you know, foreigners really don't go, and they're really scared, and they're becoming safe. And the community themselves are saying like, hey, look, if we get our act together, we can actually get some people through here and, you know, start something here. And so, and because I think that there's also a hunger from Bitcoiners and other tourists to actually hang out with the people and not themselves, right? Like, some people just yearn for that local experience, right? And so again, I think that it's providing different types of incentives, and people are realizing that. But again, we're 10 months in, we got to give it some time and see how it goes.
And as Bitcoiners, we have to look at the bigger picture. You know, Bitcoin's great and all that, but if it's not improving people's lives, what's the point? So I'm excited to see where this and other countries as well. I'm sure other countries in the region are looking at this very closely to see sort of what happens. And I don't know if the other countries, like, for those who don't know, El Salvador, you guys don't have a sovereign currency. You're using US dollar. Other countries in the region, I've been to South America, but I don't know about Central America. Do they have their own sovereign currencies as well?
Most countries do. In fact, El Salvador has the Salvadoran colon, and we don't use it. It came out of circulation some time ago. By the law, people are required to accept it and can still exchange and use it. But in practicality, nobody does. So yeah, this is one area where, did you guys see that? I think I'm here late, so they're doing cleanup now. So in practicality, they don't actually, use anything but the US dollar right now. And that would, you know, go for Bitcoin right now. But what I would say is, I think education is so important that there's, as that increases, and there's some really good, organizations like Mi Primer Bitcoin, like My First Bitcoin, and Casa del Bitcoin by, Paxful. Paxful, actually bought a house, and they host, free lessons, in San Salvador, as well as Bitcoin Beach, and, you know, numerous other organizations that are like Torogos devs, who are trying to get the first core dev from El Salvador trained. You know, these organizations are going to be really influential, and also tourism, people visiting and supporting local businesses and the economy, and infusing the country with some money and some Bitcoin, and you know, that's going to be really, really important going forward.
Well, thanks again for your time. Faris needs to go. You obviously need to go. You're getting kicked out. I need to go and have some breakfast.
Yes.
Opposite end of the day here. Thanks again for your time. And for everyone listening, we'll have all your links in the description of the show notes. Any final words or anything you want to wrap up with?
No, I mean, I know that I talked about the book. I probably shouldn't have because I'm just starting to write it, but
it's motivational.
Exactly. This will keep me accountable, and I've never done anything, so it'll be a journey to find out what it is. So, other than that, just always look at things with a critical eye when it comes to El Salvador, whether it's from friendly media or mainstream media or opposing view media, because they tend to not have the full story, right? So look at different sources and do go to El Salvador and have a vacation, and it'll be okay, Gordon.
I've traveled quite a bit, so yeah.
Oh, Gordon's been everywhere. Yeah.
Thanks, Cyrus.
Thanks again for your time.
To stay in touch.
All right, we'll see you guys.
So, thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share so we can spread this educational content to others like yourself. Visit bitcoinbasics.help.
Disclaimer. Any content provided by CoinCompass is for educational and informational purposes only and is not investment, legal, tax, or any other professional advice. A qualified professional should be consulted before making any financial decisions. CoinCompass will at times recommend certain products, services, and technologies, but these are opinions based upon our own or podcast guests' experience and not endorsements. We take no liability for out-of-date or inaccurate information, software bugs, manufacturing errors, technology misuse, or issues involving third parties. Visit coincompass.com for more information and please contact us.